Today is Friday, June 5th, 2020, which means it's Garaaga Friday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? Well, I've been away for a while, haven't I? I probably mentioned this before, but I'm the sole software developer for a startup, and therefore my life has become very hectic. We're on the precipice of real-world field tests for our technology, which includes robots, by the way. And so I'm behind the eight ball. I'm not sure when this pace is going to let up, but I'm doing my best to get all the content created and, well, etc. Alas, my so-called best hasn't been what it should be. If only I didn't have to make money. Oh well, fuck it. With that in mind, and so I can go do something else like, I don't know, write? Let's get to the story. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 6 of Legends of Garaaga. Elliston sat by the fire, warming himself. One look at his feverish face told Neratal his condition was the same as last night, if not worse. Aquila was cleaning the last of the fish on a nearby rock, while Darian minded the spits. "We have a little mission ahead of us, scouts," Neratal said. The three soldiers looked at him. He smiled. "We're going to stave off a long walk today and do a little exploring." Darian clucked his tongue. "Maybe catch some fresh meat?" "Aye," Aquila said. "A little tired of fish myself. Perhaps Elliston can stay behind and mind the gear for us." Elliston laughed and then broke into a cough. "You mean I can rest for the day?" "That too," Neratal said. He clapped a hand on the scout's shoulder. "You need it far more than the rest of us." "Then you better bring back a damn boar for me to eat," Elliston said. "If there's one to find, I'll bring it back to you head and all," Aquila said, and tossed the last fish to Darian. The forest canopy was extremely dense. The path he had discovered near the boulder had led them into a twilight tunnel. The three men, Aquila on point and Darian in the rear, walked silently over the dead ground. Whatever, or whomever, had created the path had used it over a period of many, many years. The ground was still fertile, but it seemed as though nothing would grow on it, or was given a chance. Aquila stopped every so often to look for sign, but found none. It was as though whatever made the path didn't leave footprints. The deeper they traveled into the forest, the fewer sounds they heard. The birdsong had all but disappeared, and even the insects were silent. The occasional errant footstep and his own breathing were all Neratal could hear. They had left Elliston guarding the camp. Neratal had told the ill soldier to rest as much as possible. The four scouts hadn't encountered another person in over a week. The chances any would find their camp were low. Just the same, he hoped Elliston didn't sleep too soundly. The lady in the river, the Naiade, still tugged at his mind. In daylight she had been a dream, but as they walked the darkened path, the likelihood she'd been real seemed much more possible. When Aquila stopped again and lowered himself to his haunches to examine the ground, Neratal turned and looked past Darian. The path was nearly straight. The entrance by the river glowed in the distance. Darian raised his eyebrows at Neratal. Neratal shook his head and turned back to the path before them. Aquila brushed aside some leaves that had fallen to the forest floor. His fingers gently dug in the fertile earth. Neratal fought the urge to peer over the man's shoulder with some amusement. When a soldier stopped to check for sign, he taught his men to cover the rear and protect the scout from any threats that may emerge before them. Aquila rose with something in his palm. He turned to Neratal, hand outstretched. A scrap of cloth dangled between his fingers. Neratal took it and held it up. The patch was deeply stained, but more importantly, the cloth had been cut and shredded. He remembered the deep grooves in the boulder and shuddered. Whatever had made those marks had cut the cloth as well. Neratal held up his hand and clenched it into a fist twice. Aquila nodded and resumed his quiet walk. Neratal could feel Darian behind him. The old soldier had moved a little closer to his leader, bunching up their step. There weren't enough soldiers to form a phalanx, and without shields it would have been impossible anyway. But closely knit, all holding their zyphos and striking as one, the trio had a far better chance of taking out a large beast like a bear. They continued walking for several minutes. Aquila held up a hand in a tight fist. Nerital and Darien halted, waiting for the point scout to give instructions. Then Nerital heard it. Singing. A mix of voices, men and women, old and young. The distant choir's words were unlike any he'd heard before, save the naiadi. The song broke into a chant, the same three sounds repeating over and over before breaking back into singing. Aquila turned his head to look at Nerital, brow furrowed. The leader nodded. Aquila returned the nod, turned and walked ahead, his weapon held before him. Once the young man was several lengths away, Nerital followed. Facing humans was different than facing a beast. Spreading out gave more room to fight. The sound was louder with each step. Nerital scanned from side to side, trying to find any unexpected shapes in the deep forest overgrowth. The singers were somewhere up ahead, but that didn't mean there weren't others in the forest. Darien would be doing the same, looking from side to side, turning around from time to time to check the rear. If Elliston hadn't been ill, they would be better equipped for a fight. Nerital gritted his teeth. Aquila was crouched on his knees. Nerital followed suit. The soldier raised his hand and clenched it into a fist 3 times. Enemy sighted. Nerital repeated the signal for Darien and crawled toward Aquila's position and looked through a gap in the trees. A circle of 7 naked men and women stood around an altar, hands raised. As they sang, they hunched downward and then rose as one. Strange crimson marks covered their dark-skinned backs. The chanting stopped. The group lowered their hands to their sides in silence. As Nerital watched, one of the women strode forward to the altar. The circle closed behind her. She raised her head and hands to the sky.
Garaaga!
The circle followed suit, their voices chanting the name as one. The woman dropped her arms, and the chanting ceased. A large man with long dark hair entered the clearing carrying a young woman over his shoulder. She couldn't have been older than childbearing age. Nerital frowned as the woman at the altar retreated. The giant placed the girl in the center of the altar and rejoined the others. Garaaga, the circle whispered. The woman leader touched the giant's hand. She leaned forward and kissed his chest, while the throng continued their quiet chant. The giant kissed the woman's head and then strode toward the altar. His penis hardened with each step, and his smile was filled with yellow teeth. When he reached the altar, he reached for her. The girl began to scream. Aquila leapt from the path and crashed into the brush. Nerital cursed as the members of the circle turned toward him. "Darien, attack!" Nerital cried, and followed Aquila into the clearing. The young soldier was mere lengths away from the circle when the men and women charged. Each had their hands outstretched, their faces set in screams of rage. Aquila's sword slashed in a downward diagonal, opening the stomach of the first to meet him. Blood sprayed through the air as the rest descended upon him. Nerital watched 2 more of the crowd fall beneath Aquila's slashing sword. The large giant of a man smashed a fist into Aquila's face, knocking him sideways. He stumbled and then fell as 2 women leapt atop him. Screaming a battle cry, Nerital thrust forward, catching one of the men in the back. He felt the blade pierce through the spine, kicked his foot forward, and pushed the body off the sword. Another of the party turned toward him. Nerital swung his sword in a sharp diagonal. The zyphos ripped through the man's jaw with a cracking sound. Teeth and bone flew from the man's blood-filled new mouth. As Nerital pulled the sword free, a large forearm connected with his chin. The force spun him, and he saw starlight. Instead of trying to regain his footing, Nerital let himself fall forward, crashed into a somersault, and jumped to his feet, sword swinging. The giant danced back from the slashing blade. Darian ran past to help Aquila. Nerital barely noticed. The large, naked man raised his fists and held his feet apart. Nerital smiled. He feinted with the sword. The man didn't react. His smile widened. It had been months since he'd been on a battlefield, even longer since he fought one-on-one with a worthy opponent. The screams of the dying and wounded rang in his ears, and although his heart was pounding in his chest, he focused on the man's hands and feet. Nerital moved a step forward, just outside the man's long reach. The Xiphos was too short to strike the giant without taking a few more steps. Nerital feinted a vertical strike and then flew forward. The man's arms reached for him, managing to catch his shoulder. Alexander's one-time protector slashed sideways, his blade cutting through the man's left foot. The giant bellowed and stumbled backwards. Nerital flipped the sword to his left hand and hacked at the man's inner thigh. The blade cut through the flesh and a stream of blood jetted from the wound. His opponent fell to one knee. Nerital rose and sliced down across the man's neck. The blade clanged off the giant's collarbone, making Nerital's arms vibrate. He pulled back on the blade and hit him again in the same place. The man's head parted from his body. Nerital looked up. Aquila and Darian stood side by side, heaving from exertion. Blood covered the pair. Rent flesh hung from Aquila's face in long strips, blood oozing from the wounds. The young man's left earlobe was missing, the grooves of teeth still visible in the remnants. Of the 8 bodies, 2 were still breathing. One woman had fallen after a deep vertical slash to her chest. Bits of shattered ribs stuck out from the wound. A man lay on his side, his breathing labored and erratic. He would be dead in minutes. Finish! Aquila and Darian nodded to their leader. Aquila approached the woman, dropped his Xiphos, grasped her neck in his hands, and swiveled. Her neck broke with a crunch. Darian closed his hand over the man's nose and mouth. The body didn't even twitch as it suffocated. The smell of piss, shit, and blood stung Nerital's nose. It had been a short battle, and not even a good one, but all battles ended the same. Corpses smelling of offal, and a field covered in blood. You lost your pretty one. Aquila looked up at Nerital and then at the altar. The girl was gone. Aquila nodded. Was it worth it, soldier? Nerital growled. The young scout rose from his haunches, and with his weapon in hand, he pointed his sword tip at his heart, the hilt jutting outward in supplication. Not today. Nerital walked forward past the sword and smashed a fist into Aquila's temple. Aquila fell to one knee, the Xiphos dropping from his hand. You ever do that again without orders, and I will end you. Yes, sir, Aquila grunted. Darian. Sir? If I'm not mistaken, I see huts. Darian looked past the altar and squinted at the edges of the tree line. Aye. Provisions, all we can carry. Aye, Darian said. The older man moved with cat-like grace, his sword held in the ready position as he approached the thatched huts. Nerital smiled. The oldest of his former legion, and yet by far the best. Get up. Aquila rose in a daze. When you get yourself together, soldier, you will search the area. Understood? Sir! Nerital turned his back and walked to the altar. He stared at it for a long time. Gods, he whispered. 2 trips and their packs were full. Aquila, Nerital, and Darian had looted the tiny village of dried meat, flatbread, and all the fruit they could carry. Elliston had been asleep when they returned the first time. The man looked less feverish. Nerital was glad for it. If there were other villages along the way, they might need another fighter. Aquila's wounds were not mortal, but it would take him some time to recover. The young soldier had twisted his knee during the fight and walked with a slight limp. Aquila knew better than to complain. At least the boy had learned that much. Neratal's rules for the scouts were simple. If you followed orders and tragedy befell you, that was bad luck. If you didn't obey orders or were irresponsible, then you were the source of the bad luck. Those who didn't obey orders would receive no succor from the rest of the scouts. He wanted to ask the boy why he had charged, but it didn't matter. The battle was over, and at the very least, they had managed to retrieve food and clothing. Neratal, Aquila, and Darien had grabbed their packs from the camp, filled them, and then returned to load themselves with more supplies from the village. Each of the 3 men would have to carry double their share of weight, and it would slow them down, but it was worth the risk. As Darien placed poultices on Aquila's wounds, Neratal stared at the bright green river. The crudely carved stone beast that jutted from the altar kept returning to his thoughts. The thing had arms that ended in talons and a triangular maw filled with razored teeth. The sexual organs were prominently displayed, both male and female. Strange symbols were carved into the base, like nothing he'd ever seen before. Sanskrit, the written word of the Indus peoples, was blasé by comparison. Even the language of the Egyptians seemed less cryptic. The worst part of the altar had been the figures burned into the stone. It was as if dozens of corpses had been set fire to and left to burn upon the altar, leaving the imprints of fingers and hands, heads and legs. Counting the different marks had proved impossible, since many overlapped. Neratal wondered how the marks had been made. The thought made him shiver. The young girl would have been their next sacrifice. Of that he was certain. What strange peoples were these that did such things? The Indus worshipped many gods, statues of a woman with multiple arms, a strange elephant-headed god, and dozens of others. But the altar had been something new. He'd never seen anything like the beast before. Alexander's Indus translator and guide might know, but there was no way to contact him. Neratal opened his pack and stared at a leather-bound book. His fingers trembled and then lifted it from the pack. He stared at the markings burned into the cover and turned it over in his hands. The scouts hadn't encountered a single bovine since they began their exile, yet the book cover was clearly animal hide. Deer? Something else? Darien had found it in the largest and emptiest of the huts. The rest of them had been built with woven and thatched green grass over a wooden frame. They were hardly sturdy, and Neratal wondered how much longer they would stand without the villagers there to maintain them. The largest hut had been constructed using crude wooden planks, except for a single side that was covered by a woven grass wall. The wall's opening hadn't been especially large. When Darien called Neratal to look inside the structure, he'd had to drop his pack in order to fit through the entrance. Light penetrated the structure from a single slit in its wooden roof. A table had been mounted against the lit wall. The stone pedestal standing on its surface had held the book. Whereas the other huts had been slovenly kept, the wooden one had been immaculate. "Is this a temple?" Darien had asked. Neratal had walked to the pedestal and stared at it. It seemed to glow in the light. "Darien, go outside and see if the trees have been cut above this hut." "Aye." 7 crimson-colored symbols stared back at him from the leather cover. The strange marks were composed of geometric shapes, hooks, and figures. He had rubbed his fingers across them, letting his skin feel the grooves until he was lost in them. "Sir?" Neratal flinched and then composed himself at the scout's return. "Yes?" "Looks like someone climbed up the trees above and cut the branches all the way to the canopy. This is the only area that looks like that, at least that I can see." "Temple," Neratal muttered. "Sir?" "You're right, Darien. This is a temple." Neratal removed the book from the pedestal. "Finish rounding up the supplies. Tell Aquila to get off his ass and help." "Sir." Neratal had followed the older soldier through the opening. The book was cool in his hands. Neratal opened the cover. The pages were made of dried palm leaf and covered in symbols. The left page of the book was always covered in script similar to what Alexander's Indus translator used. The right side, however, was written in a completely different hand, more elegant, more pronounced. The impressions were thinner, yet whatever had been used for ink seemed to glow. As he turned the pages, the right side's symbols seemed to dance. Nerital rubbed at his eyes and flipped to the back page of the book. The page was filled with a single symbol, a crimson-colored spiral of marks that ended in a hook at the outer edge. It was the same symbol that had been tattooed on the backs of the villagers. Nerital closed the book and returned it to his pack. He let his eyes drift back to the river. An insect hovered just above the water and disappeared in a splash as a fish gobbled it from beneath. The watch would have to be taken seriously now. No more pondering at the riverbank at night. No more leaning against a tree for comfort. Instead, they would all trade off in shorter durations, which meant less sleep. Only 4 men left, and one of their number was ill. Too few to properly guard a camp. The girl had escaped the village. It was impossible to know if she traveled to another to tell them of the battle or its outcome. With any luck, the girl would die in the forest, and the scouts would remain shadows. "Sir?" Nerital continued to stare at the river. "What is it, soldier?" "Wounds are bound." "Packs ready?" "Yes, sir." "You will carry Elliston's share as well." There was a pause. Nerital turned around to face Aquila. The young man's head was bowed. "Yes, sir." "Good," Nerital growled. Aquila nodded and headed back to the tiny camp. Nerital turned back to the river. The woman. She had been close to the boulder. Had she traveled the same path from the village? He had examined each of the female bodies, hoping to see her face among their number. But the woman hadn't been among them. If she was a dream, some hallucination brought on by fatigue, why had she appeared near the boulder and the path? "Doesn't matter," Nerital whispered. He turned from the river and walked back into the camp. Elliston stood next to Aquila, attempting to retrieve his pack from the overloaded younger scout. "He carries," Nerital said. "You walk." "Sir," Elliston said and stepped away. "Darian, are you ready?" "Aye." "You're on point." The old soldier smiled. "Of course, sir." They left the clearing and headed down the riverbank. When they passed the path that led to the dead village, Nerital fought the urge to stare into its dark mouth. When Aquila awoke him for his watch, Nerital had snapped awake immediately. Before the battle, it took time for his mind to snap back to reality, but not that night. They might be hunted. Villagers might be streaming through the woods searching for the men that had destroyed his sister habitation. Aquila hadn't said a word, merely clenched his fist once. Nothing to report. Nerital nodded and watched the soldier lay in front of the fire. He stifled a yawn and let his eyes adjust to the darkness. The afternoon had dragged on. The scouts had marched beneath the hot sun in silence. Elliston and Aquila were both winded easily, and the party had to make frequent stops. At each cessation, Darian checked the wounds on the young soldier, ensuring the poultices of mud and herb were still holding together. The sweat from the burning sun kept running into Aquila's cuts, making him wince, but again he made no complaints. Nerital was proud of the boy. Tomorrow he would distribute their load more evenly, if only to ensure they could travel faster. Clouds had finally given them some relief from the heat, but the moisture in the air stuck to them like a plague. The mosquitoes and flies enjoyed the shade, visiting the men in swarms. Fresh welts from bites covered their arms and faces. At dusk, Nerital called a halt, and they made camp in the forest. The men had to walk some distance into the tree-choked land before finding a clearing large enough for a fire pit and their gear. Darian dug the fire pit without being asked, while Aquila and Elliston sat up against the trees. "You will sleep," Neratal said to Elliston. You look better than yesterday, but not well enough for my liking. Sir, I feel... Food, rest, sleep. That's an order. Aye. Darian, once you get the fire going, you're on first watch. Sir, the old man growled. Short shifts. Once the moon rises, wake Aquila. At its apex, he said as he turned to the young soldier, you will wake me. Aquila nodded. Dry for evening meal? Yes, start unpacking. Neratal had walked the perimeter of the small clearing. The trees were thinner in that part of the forest. He saw remnants of an old fire that must have made room for the young bark. At least they would have a clearer sight line in the night, but less of the moon's light would penetrate the canopy so deep in. Aquila had set out some of the booty from the village, dried meat and fruit. The men had eaten in silence. When they finished, Neratal cleared some leaves from the ground and picked up a stick. We are going to Lothal, he had said. From Lothal, we'll secure passage to Ur. The scouts had looked at him expectantly. He smiled. Then we're going to Babylon. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Darian rubbed at his beard. If the king has sent orders to Babylon, we'll be in chains, or worse. Neratal pulled the book from his pack and held it up. We have something to trade now. What is that? Elliston asked. The villagers kept it in some sort of temple, Darian said. Elliston grinned. You think Alexander will want it? Absolutely he will. At the very least, the magistrate will keep us safe until his return, and who knows how long that will be. It's a gamble, sir, Aquila said. Yes, it is, but it's either that or we wander this valley for the rest of our lives. With that, Neratal had placed the book back in his pack and laid out the watch list. The men said nothing more about the plan. As Darian took first watch, Elliston and Aquila were already asleep. Neratal followed soon after into a dreamless, restless drowse. He kept the fire to his back, glancing up into the leaf-choked sky. The moon was directly over them, although Neratal could barely make out a sliver of its shape. At least it wouldn't interfere with his night vision. Without the intense moonlight, it would be difficult for him to spot interlopers. The small fire crackling in the pit was more than enough to scare off most animals, but would serve as a beacon to any looking for them. Should put it out, he thought. Elliston's infrequent phlegm-choked coughs were another indicator of their position. If anyone was looking for them, they'd find the party easily enough. If Alexander had changed his mind and decided exile was not a strong enough punishment, they would have already died 1,000 times over. Exile for service, Neratal thought. He sneered in the darkness. He and his scouts traveled for months, gathering intelligence in the dangerous mountains and valleys apart from the comfort of the tents and servants, eating what they could scavenge or hunt. As had been planned, Neratal's scouts attempted to meet up with the army more than a month after their departure, in order to convey news. The army was not to be found. Alexander's forces had split into 3, each taking a different path into the Indus. Neratal had not known that, not until he found a regiment in the eastern portion of the country. By the time he and his scouts located Alexander's main camp, the rest of his men had died, all but the 3 sleeping near the fire. He wondered how many other groups like his had been sent for folly, only to be awarded with exile or execution. Zeus Amun-Ra, he muttered. Neratal scanned the woods and walked in a slow circle, his back to the fire. He stopped. A chill rattled his bones. He took a deep breath and clenched the Xiphos tightly. Many lengths in the distance, the outline of a face stared at him. Its head was triangular, like that of the village altar. The eye sockets were deep set and blank. Neratal forced his eyes to blur, let them refocus, and stared again. The shape dissolved into a meaningless pattern of shadows. He let out the breath in his lungs. Just another trick of the trees. Since leaving the mountains and entering the forest along the river, the night watches could get spooky. Every once in a while, a tree's thick branches would become a grinning face or some djinn-like visage. But the singer in the river... Garaaga, the villagers had chanted. He'd heard the name before, and now that he thought about it, perhaps the Naiades had sung it. Maybe. Or maybe it was just his mind looking for connections that weren't there. A branch cracked in the forest to his left. He slowly turned toward the sound Xiphos held before him. The small shape moved slowly across the forest floor. Another rodent of some kind. They had seen many strange animals since entering the Indus. Waterfowl that stood on long legs, rodents with long bodies, and, of course, more snakes than Nerital had imagined possible. He watched the shape move off deeper into the forest. The crackle of animals stepping on dead branches was another standard of night watch. That and the rattle of limbs or the whooshing wind high in the canopy. Nerital glanced at his sleeping men and smiled. Another crack caught his attention, and he turned. The face was back. Only this time it was closer, larger. He blurred his vision once more and then refocused. The outline was still there. Still facing it, he reached down and felt for a rock or stick, anything he could use. His fingers finally touched something solid, and he pulled it up with his left hand. The shadowy outline hadn't moved. He cocked back his arm and threw a heavy stick into the brush, aiming for the grinning visage. The stick bounced off a tree a foot away from the shape. Still, it didn't move. Nerital held his breath, waiting. A light wind rustled through the trees. He fought the urge to blink, staring into that face, that shape. Another branch cracked somewhere in the forest. Nerital ignored it. The shape's mouth seemed to open wider, the eyes narrowing. The fire popped. Nerital jumped in surprise. Adrenaline vibrating his body, he looked back where the shape had been. It was gone.